I generally find Twitter to be a pretty unedifying platform and not worth visiting for any very thought-provoking things, but last year I encountered a tweet and it really took me aback. It took me by surprise. It struck me. I can only paraphrase because I can't find the original, but it went something like this. The only way to make sense of the Western world right now is by reference to the demonic. Now, as a Christian, this should perhaps have occurred to me sooner, though obviously I would have mocked the suggestion in my atheist days. Curiously though, I've since shown the tweet to one or two non-believing friends, and even they seem to have responded to something in it. Now, ultimately, the idea that much of the degeneracy of the Western world is due to the demonic, or indeed the diabolic, can't be taken literally. It can only be taken metaphorically. Most people in the West are no longer religious. Certainly this is the case in Britain. Even as metaphor, the point can only appeal to social conservatives, the way I see it, because they already see in the West a profound sickness anyway. To those who think that the West in its present state is in rude health and can only get better as it proceeds inexorably to utopia, anything supernatural is sure to be regarded as an unwelcome hindrance, as indeed the Christian faith has always been regarded by revolutionaries of all stripes. Anyway, to my knowledge, Christians are not required to subscribe to any systematic, thoroughly worked out doctrine concerning the devil. Indeed, most of our imagery of the satanic, the demonic, the diabolic, comes to us via the florid imaginations of Dante, Milton, and the medieval peasant mind. Satan really means adversary, as many people know, or tempter, or deceiver, and diabolic originally means disintegration. This is to be contrasted with the symbolic, which means the drawing together of what's separate into a fresh and significant whole. Seen in this light, or perhaps I should say darkness, the demonic, whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, becomes far easier to notice in the various trends, conflicts and pathologies by which the Western world is afflicted. Of these, the one that looms largest is the so-called culture war. This is diabolic simply in virtue of its name. All war and all conflict separates, disintegrates, maims, sunders, whereas God, whom Athanasius calls the source of all goodness, by his love creates, integrates, and heals. I should say before continuing that I'm not one of those to whom the culture war is totally insignificant, or, as some people believe, a complete fiction, dreamt up by the far right as an excuse to sow discord. That this conflict exists cannot, I think, be doubted, and the policies and ideologies by which it was caused and to which it has given rise are to be strenuously resisted. That said, it is undoubtedly a trashy war that brings out the worst in both sides. For me, it's less a question of whether to pick a side. Christians are always in some sense against the world, and therefore that's their side. They don't really have a choice. It's more of a question of how to argue one's case without succumbing to the lowest common denominator. A good example of this is anger. Now, from the Christian perspective, anger is a serious passion of the soul. In the words of St. Isaac the Syrian, "Do not pass through the streets of the hot-tempered and quarrelsome, lest your heart be filled with anger and the darkness of delusion dominate your soul." We should try to avoid feeling angry at any created being. Nor by extension should we reach judgments in such a state. Anger is the arrogation by a created being of the wrath that belongs properly to the Creator. This is why we are commanded judge not. Criticism in a general sense is simply anger controlled and projected outwards. The only proper use of anger is to protect one or another's soul from sin, which etymologically means missing the mark, or, in the colourful language of Francis Spufford, the habit of fucking things up. Whenever you judge another person, you've basically fallen victim to the delusion that you can see the sin in them. Anger is primed to notice sin, when actually you've only really seen the sin in yourself, your propensity to that sin, your weakness in the face of it, your discomfort in the knowledge that you are no less prone to it. Judge not, lest ye be judged is another way of saying the sin you see in others is the sin you see in yourself. This is a biblical way of describing what modern psychologists call projection. Recall, moreover, the myth of Lucifer's fall, and how he fell in anger, stewing for all time in unstinting envy of the man he refused to reverence. Insofar as the culture war is characterized by nothing more than anger, and insofar as anger is, for the preceding reasons, diabolic, the culture war is diabolic. But what other evidence can we adduce for, as it were, the diabolic hypothesis? In a sense, the search for evidence is so easy and fruitful as to be pointless and fruitless. As fallen beings, disintegration is ubiquitous and thus hardly worth pointing out. Everything we do, say, and think has the lowly stamp of man's first disobedience, to quote Darwin and Milton in the same breath. Nevertheless, the devil, as they say, is in the details, and every epoch is either graced or cursed with its own unique and unrepeatable details, in much the same way as there is no such thing as a true synonym. Speaking only for myself, I can see the diabolic in our own time in the following by no means exhaustive phenomena. The first is metaphysics. Now, this is obviously something of a dirty word nowadays. As a former student of philosophy, I've been amazed to discover since graduating that questions of the ultimate nature of reality, questions that have occupied the greatest minds in human history, from Plato to Aristotle, Epicurus, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Augustine, and so on, suddenly cease to fascinate us. We just don't care about them anymore. We don't ask them at any very systematic level. We don't have a shared metaphysics. We just don't seem to be interested. And there's a reason for this, and it stems largely from Francis Bacon. In formulating the scientific method as we have come to know it, Bacon realized that, strictly speaking, only two forms of explanation, or to use the Aristotelian terms, causation, were needed. The material, what's something made of, and the efficient, what's it caused by, what's it moved by. Armed with these two simple criterion, we have sent men to the moon and cured them of smallpox. Aristotle's final cause, his fourth cause, the ultimate purpose for which a thing is created or moved or changed or conceived, has been erased from the picture. Is it any wonder then that the prevailing metaphysics of modernity is brute materialism? If all that the scientific method sees is material, electrons, protons, molecules, and so on, and not for any convincing philosophical reason, but out of methodological convenience, then culture, which is downwind of metaphysics, is liable to the same narrow-minded prison house of nothing-butness. Friendship becomes nothing but an evolutionarily beneficial alliance. Love itself becomes nothing but the interaction of chemicals in the brain. This is not perhaps the place to proffer an exhaustive rebuttal of the nothing but school of thought, as much as I'd like to. Suffice it to say that modernity's metaphysic is diabolic to the extent that it dissolves what is to most people an intuitively holistic understanding of the world in which we live and move and have our being. It takes what we know to be the case from daily experience, the experience of truth, beauty, goodness, love, the deep coincidence of these things with reality at its deepest level, and tells us, like the serpent in Eve's ear, that we are wrong. Our intuitions are wrong. So much so highfalutin, but it sets the scene for one of the hallmarks of the diabolic, which is inversion. How many things have been taken for granted for literally thousands of years that are now completely open to question? The most obvious is that there are men and there are women, and that men and women are very different. This was so obvious and so uncontroversial that to have questioned it at almost any other point in human history probably would have been taken as evidence of the demonic. Now, however, we are required to believe not only that men can become women and vice versa. I don't just mean the sort of bog standard transgender standard of, wanting to pass as the other sex. I mean that the belief is afoot that you can in fact biologically alter your sex into the opposite sex, or indeed that there is no such thing as biological sex, and that is the extreme ideological position to which I refer. But it's worse than this. The diabolic thrives on outright contradiction. That's the ultimate form of inversion, I suppose. So the very same people who accuse science of being an instrument of European hegemony are the ones demanding we trust the science when it suits them. Science itself has been deified and made monolithic. In other words, it's become an idol for the purpose of idol worship, and scientists, in particular those allied with institutional power, have become the high priests. This amounts to the worship of abstraction. Remember, in the Christian tradition, God is a person and not some nameless force. So it stands to reason that the diabolic would have us revere its opposite. St. Paul spoke of powers and principalities, spirit beings who serve their master, Satan. Again, even if we take this just metaphorically, the evidence is disturbing. We have gone in our societies from the position, for instance, of safe, legal and rare abortion to, in some quarters, its actual celebration. We've arrived, that is, at the worship of Moloch, who demanded the sacrifice of children by their own parents. To take another example, we've gone from the position that money is needed for sustenance and commerce but isn't a good in itself, to the acquisition of wealth entirely for its own sake. Slimy politicians speak as though GDP were the measure of all things, while, to quote Auden, blind skyscrapers use their full height to proclaim the strength of collective man. We have arrived at the worship of Mammon. You often hear Christian conservatives say that we live in a post-Christian era. But this is only true in the sense that we have at least collectively abandoned Christ, whose followers live increasingly in the catacombs. Now, if what I've said so far is anything to go by, we're not so much living in a post-Christian era as we are in the era of Antichrist. For the Catholic philosopher Ivan Illich, liberal secular institutions have taken the spontaneous, gratuitous love embodied in Christ and tried to institutionalize that love and turning it into an obligation. Hence the constant demand or command from governments and companies and so on, the entire corporate world, and the public sector no less, that we show love and tolerance and diversity and equity and inclusion, or else. We have arrived at the worship of progress. In the end, what we're really worshipping is us, ourselves. You can see this in artificial intelligence. We're in love with the machines that seem to hold a mirror to our own ingenuity. It doesn't matter if AI really does ever become conscious. I don't think it will, because I don't think the human mind is anything like a machine in any way whatsoever. But again, even if it did, we'd only be fawning prostrate at the feet of our own image, like Narcissus. AI is just another idol. But self-worship is evident everywhere, from selfies to celebrities, and in a disguised fashion, our reluctance to get married and start families, requiring as this does the suppression of selfish desires and an unconditional commitment to others. We see the same selfishness in our political assumptions. Instead of seeing society as what Burke called the unwritten compact between the dead, the living, and the yet-to-be-born, we've taken the Thomas Paine line that the present owes nothing to the future or the past. As a result, the public square is awash with rights demands, and politicians enact fiscal policies with no thought beyond the next election cycle. And of course, we see the rewriting of history and the desecration of the dead and their monuments. "Things fall apart," said Yeats. "The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born." I'll be honest, I've no idea what Yeats is on about, and I refuse to Google it because there are too many second-hand opinions in the world as it is. Maybe it isn't about anything. As a poet myself,
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
I know that some of a poem's best lines emerge unbidden, a gift and not an invention. Sometimes a writer feels himself or herself to be an amanuensis. Either way, Yeats's Second Coming captures the mood. I can never read it without a feeling of all-pervasive dread, as though some beast somewhere had indeed awoken. It little matters whether we call it Moloch or Skynet. Like the queasy hush before a storm, the atmosphere throbs with a kind of perverse whale song heard in the depths of the ocean. But now I'm mixing my metaphors. The point is that something is afoot. Much as the universe is expanding at an ever-increasing rate, society at present is like a boulder pushed off a hill and collecting speed. Our own inventions have been turned, i.e. inverted, against us. Science gave us the power to manipulate the world. Now the science manipulates us. The problem compounds itself as well. We feel that there's nothing we can do to arrest the process, precisely because we approach the solution with the same blinkered mindset. It never occurs to us that the solution to pathological reason cannot involve reasoning our way out of the pathology. Indeed, it never occurs to us that there might not be a solution per se, because the world is not a problem. Recall that the diabolic, who breaks things apart, is the opposite of the symbolic, which gathers things into their wholes. Now, this corresponds rather neatly with the left and right brain hemispheres. Psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist has shown how the left hemisphere evolved with one purpose in mind: to get without being got. The left hemisphere is built for power and manipulation. Its perspective is narrow, it doesn't know or even suspect what it doesn't know, and, as you'd expect, it's always convinced it's right. It sees the parts and not the whole. The right hemisphere, in McGilchrist's terms the master, the left being the emissary, evolved to see the bigger picture. It understands context, metaphor, time, space, emotion, the fact that we are embodied, in short, everything that makes us human. This is demonstrated by the fact that right hemisphere stroke patients quite literally lose their bearings on reality. Though still able for the most part to speak, unlike left hemisphere stroke patients, they are so disconnected from reality that they may even refuse to recognize the very existence of the left side of their own bodies. McGilchrist contends, in effect, that modern society is pathologically left-brained, and, to bring things full circle, it so happens that the left hemisphere is the angry one. Now, the relevance of all this to the diabolic mind should by now be clear, and not just in the incidental sense. The devil, after all, is left-handed. A diabolic society would be one in which the wholes, so obvious to our ancestors, the existence of God or gods, the interconnectedness of man and nature and of men and women with their own bodies, the intuition that there exists a realm of value that's not subject to human whim, all of this has been picked apart, debunked, denied, derided, inverted. And that, of course, is quite obviously the society we live in. I had planned on finishing there, but as though to underscore everything I've been saying, life provided me with a much more convenient ending, and in the form of another tweet no less. I'll leave a link in the description, but basically, a very self-important looking young lady can be seen ripping a Bible to shreds while shouting "Hail Satan" at a Satan con in the United States, because of course there's such a thing as a Satan con, and of course it's in the United States. God bless America. Now obviously this speaks for itself, but what really speaks volumes, and ought certainly to give even the wettest liberal a very protracted pause for thought, is that one of the main institutional opponents of the repeal of Roe v. Wade is the Satanic Temple.